Islamic legal maxims, or what one would describe as the proverbs and sayings of the Quran and Sunnah. What the scholars have put together as those traffic rules, if I may use that metaphor, that guide us through decisions in life. And while for some these are legal maxims, I think they are nuggets of wisdom that help ensure that all decisions are biased in direction or in the direction of the Quran and Sunnah, that all decisions are purposeful, that all decisions are in tandem and in alignment with the teachings of Islam. These maxims cover a broad range of domains when it comes to our lives. The maxims give an articulation of the spirit of the Quran and Sunnah. There are 5 of these major maxims, and most other maxims fall under one of these. Sometimes you may say it could fall under this one or the other one, but generally these universal maxims referred to as the qawaid al-fiqhiyya, the maxims of Islamic thinking or Islamic jurisprudence. There are 5 of them in number. We discussed the first of them, al-umur bimaqasidiha, that matters are judged by the purposes, their intents. And there we looked at how matters are judged by both the sincerity, what's going on in the heart, based on the hadith. Actions are judged by intentions, innamal a'mal binniyat. But the maxim matters are judged by their purposes is also concerned with the consequences, with the purposefulness and the impact of actions or words. And so al-umur bimaqasidiha is also supported with the hadith where the Prophet said, innamal a'mal bil hawatim, that matters are judged by how they end. In other words, the ends should be good, just as the means should be good, just as the intent should also be good. We looked at the second maxim, which was certainty is not overruled by doubt. Al-yaqin la yazulu bi-shak. And a lot of what that maxim was about, which we discussed last time, was maximizing certainty, being more evidence-based in decision, moving away from weaker evidence and weaker proof to stronger proof. And we discussed how in every field of human endeavor, in law, in mathematics, in philosophy, in economics, in engineering, in medicine, in every field, they have ways of assessing evidence and different levels of certainty. Even in the arts, even in taste, what's the evidence that something tastes better than others? They are actually experts in the field. You've got baristas of coffee who have global competitions in telling you which is the best tasting coffee. So even though it looks as if this is very subjective, you can get a congregation of expert opinion preferring one thing over the other. And so in every domain in life, we should try to move to closer to the truth, truth being what has more proof or what is closer to what has more proof, even if ultimately we would not be 100% certain about a particular thing, but let's move in the direction of greater certainty and to avoid what we have more doubts and uncertainty about. The third maxim, which we will be looking at today, is a very important one of these 5 universals. Next time, inshallah, we will be looking at the 4th maxim, which is al-mashaqqa tajlibu taysir, that hardship begets facility. And the last maxim, al-ada muhakkama, that custom is a basis of law or has the weight of law. Today we will be looking at al-ḍarar yuzāl. Al-ḍarar yuzāl means harm must be removed. Harm must be eliminated. It's a maxim that is concerned with removing threats to the maqasid of Sharia. It's a maxim that is concerned with any way of eliminating or reducing harm to those things that Sharia wants to see. So to the threats to life, threats to the growth of the intellect, threats to human dignity, threats to environment, threats to animals, threats to the next generation, threats to wealth and property. It's concerned with removing threats to family, threats to society. So it's very concerned with removing harm, and it's very problem focused. Next time we will look at the maxim that is victim focused. This issue of identifying who is going through difficulty and how do we help the victim. So that's looking at the victim and how do we help. So that would be, say, medical aid to a victim. Here we are looking at the person who is focusing on the threat, focusing on the virus. How do we prevent it from coming? How do we stop it doing its damage? Or how do we reduce the damage it causes? When we look at al-ḍarar yuzāl, darar means harm, and here we are talking about any form of harm to good. Anything that is bad, anything that is evil, anything that has a disadvantage greater than its advantage. Al-ḍarar yuzāl is concerned about injustice, it's concerned about extremism, it's concerned about anything, even good, being too much. Medicine is good, but too much can kill. So it's very concerned also, therefore, about balance and moderation, this idea of wasatiyah, again, for both individuals and for communities. The source of this maxim, you know, as we said, a lot of these maxims get their articulation from certain hadith, but then are paraphrased. Excuse me. So they get the wording and the articulation from certain hadith, but then they are paraphrased in such a way that they can accommodate other verses of the Quran and hadith. The darar, harm, must be eliminated. We have hadith where the Prophet says, la darar wa la dirar, do not harm, do not reciprocate harm. In other words, all form of harm is prohibited, and things that are harmful are called various names in the Quran and in the Sunnah. So it may be something that is haram. Abdullah bin Abbas, one of the respected companions of the Prophet, said, whenever the Quran or Sunnah tells you to avoid something and calls it haram, it is because it is trying to protect you from something that is harmful, something that is detrimental, either to your spiritual growth or your moral or ethical growth, or to wealth, to individuals, to society, or just to other living things. Sometimes what is prevented is hurting other animals, not because it hurts you directly, but it does hurt you spiritually, it does hurt your fitrah if you get desensitized to suffering of other creatures. So it, you know, harm can be harm to your humanity and your humaneness. Words that and concepts that are related to harm include injustice or dhulum, and corruption. Some would use the word fasad, fil ard. So a lot of verses on the Quran about don't cause corruption on earth, don't spoil what is good. Fitna, usually for strife and trials and suffering. Fahisha, usually for immorality or unethical behavior, things that are munkar, that we would call wrongdoing, or madar, just harmful, things that cause injury. So we have a lot of verses of the Quran, a lot of hadith on avoiding bad, preventing bad. We have the common hadith where the Prophet said, whoever sees something wrong, whoever sees something wrong should change it or substitute it with something good, do it with your hand or the authority you possess, do it with your tongue, in other words, through communication, or change it with your heart. So you don't, you can't be apathetic to wrong and corruption and harm. In a sense, Muslims should always be looking for troubles of others or the troubles of society. We should focus on removing problems and giving relief. The golden rule, none of you is a true believer, none of you has faith until he loves for his brother what he loves for himself, also applies to, since we don't like harm, we shouldn't like it for others. We don't do unto others what we wouldn't want others to do unto us. The metaphor, and I've used some already, of this maxim, al-ḍarar yuzāl, that harm must be removed, harm must be eliminated, would be somebody who focuses on identifying problems and solving them. The policeman, for example, the public health official who is concerned with cleanliness of the environment. And he does that because if he can do his job well, then we have less victims of health problems. It's the mechanic who wants to solve the problem with the car. How smooth is your ride is related to how much problems you have. People who work as mediators, where they only get up to do their job if there's a problem, or if they see tension growing, then they try to see how to solve. So they basically wake up when there's a problem. It's like firefighters. This maxim is a firefighter type of maxim. It's one that focuses on problem. It's the plumber, put it that way, one who only comes to your house when there's a problem. It's in a way like a doctor. Only see the doctor when there's a problem. Most of us don't, it's not like food where you need it every day. It's usually when there's a problem, you go to see the doctor, unfortunately for many doctors, or maybe fortunately in some cases. This maxim, al-ḍarar yuzāl, is concerned therefore with what you call, you can look at it as a stain remover. It's interested in removing blemish and what is wrong in society. When we say something is wrong, as we've said earlier, we mean what is destructive, what is bad to the maqasid and the objectives of Sharia, what causes harm and suffering. It is when the harm of something is greater than the benefit. There's an understanding that nearly everything with an advantage has disadvantages, but the existence of disadvantages does not automatically make something bad. The disadvantage, the harm, has to be greater than the benefit. And so when discussing alcohol, for example, the Quran talks about it having benefits and harm, but that the harm outweighs the benefit. So in certain domains in life, the way to know if something is harmful, maybe because the Quran already explicitly says so, but the use of this maxim is usually to guide us where the Quran may be silent. And that is where it's important to have ulama al-waqi, they call them, or scholars of the context, scholars of that particular profession. It is people from the medical profession that may be better at health impact assessment to know whether the health or benefit, the harm or benefit of something to health would be greater or less. It is dietitians who may be best at telling us whether a particular additive whether sugar of a particular quantity, whether any chemical to food that would help preserve it has side effects that are greater than the benefit of those. So the need to recognize that in assessing levels and scopes of harm and types of harm, we need scholars who have understanding of impact assessment. We need fatwa councils to consult with the professionals of a field, as we found during the COVID period. Ulama consulting with epidemiologists and people who know about viruses and vaccines and epidemics and pandemics in order to advise whether this problem is serious enough to shut down the haram for pilgrimage or close mosques, or whether we should exercise social distancing, and whether these things should just be moral pieces of advice or whether they should be turned into law that restricts travel, restricts movement. So it's the experts of those areas, because if you recall, when the Quran was being revealed, there was no group of people that you describe as clergy. What you had was everyday people who were very knowledgeable about their religion. And so because this assessment of harm requires knowledge and requires greater certainty, not just because one person was harmed, therefore something is to be prohibited. Just because somebody was killed in a car accident on his way to work doesn't mean people should be stopped from going to work. There has to be an assessment of the risk, the probability of it happening, not just the severity of the wrong. When we talk about al-ḍarar yuzāl, that harm must be eliminated, it's also harm of any level, minor harm, major harm. The harm may just be poor language skills. That can be harmful if you plan to study a subject that requires language skills like law. If you're going to write a contract, you need good control and understanding of languages. So any degree of harm, you basically look at what can you do to reduce or eliminate harm. It doesn't have to be life-threatening harm or limb-threatening harm or mind-threatening harm or property-threatening harm. It may be any form of damage. Just scratching a car is a harm that should not be tolerated, just because we don't have clear verses in the Quran or Hadith about scratching cars. That still doesn't make it permissible. The default position of any form of harm, which we discussed last time, the default position, the legal default in Islam is that harm is haram. That harm is haram by default. The moment something is harmful, Sharia assumes it is haram, and you need evidence that it is not. And this harm could be in the form of harmful ideas, like shirk, ideas that make people do wrong things, that make people more superstitious instead of going with evidence, that make people hurt others through all sorts of funny ideas that, oh, you know, somebody did magic or cast a spell on me, and or instead of taking an illness to a doctor, somebody says, no, we'll just do dua. That can be a harmful idea. We do dua, but we also seek medicine. And since the Prophet said, you know, for every illness, Allah has also revealed a cure. So what we find is we should be cure seeking. The Sahaba did seek cures for illnesses. So harm may be in the form of ideas, it may be habits, it may be information that misguides and allows people to make wrong prescriptions. Harm may be physical, it may be spiritual, it may be to any of the maqasid, it may be information that makes people more prejudiced against others, it may be falsehood that misguides decision-making, and some of these decisions can have significant consequences. It may be misinformation about people that make us become prejudiced or discriminatory. It may be stereotypical information that makes us racist or tribalistic or bigoted against people, and therefore becomes a form of injustice. So harm could be to ourselves, to other creatures, to more than just human beings. The value of creation goes beyond just its utilitarian value. So when we talk about harm, it's not just you harm things that feel pain, and if it doesn't feel pain, it's not harmful. If you just spoil beauty, it's harmful. Just destroying, just flattening a mountain for no reason. When mountains play very important roles, they're the food reserves of humanity. Weathering breaks mountains down into soil, into dust, and releases these nutrients into the soil that plants are able to turn into food. And so ultimately, most of our nutrition and foods are currently in the form of dust that comes from soil. So, this dust to dust, that's where we come from. That's what sustains life. You can't just treat environment in an irresponsible manner, because it also has a value that we are responsible for preserving as khulafa, as vicegerents, as stewards that Allah has created on earth. In the principles of Islamic jurisprudence, or the subject of usulul fiqh, you have certain principles that are used to prevent harm when it comes to fatwas. So you would hear, for example, of maslaha, concern for public interest. So the moment something is going to negatively impact on the common good, scholars would use the principle of maslaha to make new laws that would prevent harm. And so even though you would say traffic rules are man-made laws, but because the traffic laws are made for public interest, they are to prevent harm. They have a saddu zaria, a preclusionary, a blocking means to harm function. They are Islamic laws. Islamic in the sense of endorsed by Islam. They meet Islamic requirements, even though they don't originate in a direct sense from the Quran and the Sunnah, but they are endorsed by the desire of the Quran and Sunnah to bring benefit and prevent harm. Istihsan, juristic preference, is a principle used by scholars to promote good. Istishab, which we discussed last time, the legal defaults, that people are innocent until proven guilty, that innocence is the default, not guilt as the default. Guilt has to be proven. The default position that justice means equality, these maxims and legal defaults are also there to protect goodness and prevent harm, so that in judgment, we don't operate on the assumption that people are bad by default. No, they are good by default, that everything is halal except what is haram, and that we are more certain of that. So as we said in the very beginning, these maxims operate together. To understand this maxim better, I would share with us some of the related maxims before we look into application and how scholars apply these maxims, because I think understanding how the related maxims and the sub-maxims is itself a commentary on this major maxim: harm must be eliminated, al-ḍarar yuzāl. So harm is measured by its direct effect or its impact. So when we say something is harmful, so when we say this medicine is harmful, what we mean is the direct effect of medicine is greater, the negative effect is greater than the benefit. Harm can be measured in different ways. So it may be medicine, it may be a policy. In order to measure, is it good or bad, we want to first look at what is the direct impact of this. We would like to look at the severity. So something that is harmful but very severe, something that can kill, for example, is a greater harm than something that only debilitates. or something that just pinches or hurts a little. So it's all harm, but we measure harm and we recognize that there are different severities of harm. We can also look at harm from its scope, the number of people it affects. A flu may not be a problem for one person in a working environment, but it does become a bigger problem when more people or most people are being infected by it. A flu may not be a big problem to a student, but it may become a problem during exams. A flu may not be a problem for a laborer or a taxi driver, but it may be a big problem for a surgeon. So you also look at the demographic, who is being affected by this. So, you know, illness to our president would have a much greater impact than illness to most other people. We also measure harm based on its duration. So something that is temporary, a temporary harm would be considered less harmful than a more permanent harm, something that's chronic and would last longer. A harm that is reversible and therefore, you know, has a, you know, you could go back to status quo, is less dangerous than an irreversible harm, where we can't go back to our old situation. It's a permanent change. The condition of the victim, partly what we've mentioned, a harm to somebody who is already sick may be more grievous than a harm to somebody who is healthy. But a very important thing is to look at also side effects. When we say something is harmful, let's not just look at, oh, this is harmful, therefore we stop it. What are the side effects? You may actually find that somebody is sick and a medical procedure would be an operation, and that will solve the problem. But sometimes the harm of the procedure is greater than its benefit. The person could or would most likely die from the cure. In other words, the side effect, which is just what we call effects that are not the direct intention, is still just an effect. So you need to really be careful when you say something is harmful, because preventing all harm, we may realize we're preventing certain things that actually have more benefit. And when it comes to something we would like to say is good, but the side effect is undesirable, but sometimes the side effect may be greater than the main effect. And the reason why I'm saying this is because it is really, really important in the modern, very interconnected world for us to consult experts. Just knowing this maxim is not enough. You need to consult. Shura is something, the Quran, the consultation with people, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ, especially with people who know their subject areas, is really critical before laws are made that restrict and end up becoming a problem. And some laws, after they've expired, end up, you know, becoming a problem. And the law that had a good intention before, but has outlived its purposefulness, that is not reformed and changed, becomes a harm that itself has to be removed by Sharia. Sharia concerns averting harm as a priority over gaining benefit. So when the plus and minuses are the same, the positive impact and the negative impact, Sharia is more risk averse. It considers prohibiting harm as a priority and averting harm as a priority over accruing an equal benefit. A maxim that is related to this is also one which states that harm may not be inflicted or reciprocated. In other words, don't initiate harm. And when somebody initiates it, try not to reciprocate. Let it be handled by the legal system. So there's no taking the law into your own hands. What is an obligation what is necessary for removing a harm is treated like the harm. So if to remove a harm, we need to go and remove the harm, then going becomes an obligation, just as removing the harm. So the judgment of the means to the harm is given through the means itself, not just the harm. So if, for example, pulling a trigger kills a person, then pulling a trigger is killing. It's as bad as what it leads to. And so when it comes to identifying harm, Sharia requires us to also identify the pathways to harm. So in preventing harm or stopping harm, we need to look at the means that lead to those harm or that particular form of harm. What is prohibited is also prohibited to all alike. When something is harmful and has been identified as haram, it's haram irrespective of male or female or social standing, race or ethnicity, religion, etc. So once something is haram, a Muslim is supposed to not do it to anybody. Harm must be eliminated to the extent possible. There's an understanding that we may not be able to remove all harm completely. We may not be able to remove poverty completely. We may not be able to remove disease completely, but we will do the best we can. Mastata'atum, ittaqillah mastata'atum, the Quran says. The Prophet says also, when I ask you to do something or to avoid something, do it to the best of your ability. And here, when it comes to harm, we have to ask ourselves, can we prevent this harm from happening? Can we isolate, quarantine the harm, as it were? It may be a habit that somebody is harmful, and so we put them in prison or some correctional center. So can it be cured? Can it be isolated? Can it be eliminated? Can it be prevented? Can we vaccinate people so that they are resilient and resistant? They are immunized from harm. Would that solve the problem? Sometimes that's actually easier and cheaper than this firefighting approach towards certain illnesses. But very often we can't eliminate or remove. Sometimes we can't cure completely, but we can reduce the harm. We can reduce the damage. We can reduce the impact. And so there again, we do the best we can to the extent possible. As we've already said, what leads to harm is treated as a harm. Whatever is a prerequisite to a harm or a haram is self-treated as a harm and haram. Where forced to choose between two evils, as much as possible, we try to choose the lesser evil. But scholars would say when forced to choose between two evils, try and create a third option. Can we actually not have to choose between two evils? Can we be more creative and find a solution? In other words, we're forced to choose between two evils, create a third that is lesser than the two. But a general rule is choose the lesser evil or choose the greater good. Lesser harm may be tolerated if it would prevent a greater harm. Lesser harm is not removed by causing a greater harm. What is forbidden to take is forbidden also to give. What is forbidden and harmful should not be given to others, nor should others be requested to do what is forbidden or harmful. So when we look at this maxim, al-ḍarar yuzāl, it expresses itself in many ways that are not explicit in the Quran and in the Sunnah. So the prohibition, for example, of a victim taking the law into his own hands. Otherwise you misappropriate justice. Things result in a vendetta system of people just going into vengeance and a cycle of violence. There are penalties for breaking any rules or laws that protect people from harm. So breaking traffic rules, causing suffering to animals, environmental laws, because this can result in not just injustice to one generation, but intergenerational injustice. Removing harms that cause difficulty in young people getting married, finding a suitable spouse, premarital counseling, anything that can help promote good or reduce the chances of people getting married to the wrong person and the damage that does not just to their relationship, but sometimes, unfortunately, children are part of that collateral damage. Prevention of harms of dysfunctional marriage, prevention of domestic abuse and violence. all the things surrounding gender-based violence or any form of violence. Could we have more improved, more efficient legal procedures? Could we have alternative dispute resolution and counseling services? When we look at the long-term cost of poverty, the long-term cost of social inequality and economic inequality, usually measured also by the Gini index, just the gap between the rich and the poor, and the kind of harm that causes by people being more predisposed to greater grievances that lead to all sorts of misuse of religion in order to correct grievances. And so we find a lot of extremism is not just about extreme ideology. Ideology without grievances usually doesn't produce movement. Most extremists use religion as a form of a liberation theology to liberate themselves. They may go too far, but once you see the grievances, you may actually agree that we both agree this is a grievance, this is a problem, it has to be addressed, but we may differ in the method of removing it. Any obstacles to better healthcare, education, employment, rights, and dignity towards self-determination, removing harms that are caused by various forms of religious extremism, but which lead to extremism. And sometimes it's just removing ignorance among people, because that ignorance allows them to be more susceptible to harmful ideas. We also need to look at institutionalized forms of harm, structural injustice, prejudice, social phobias, whether it is racism, whether it's Islamophobia, whether it's Christianophobia, whether it's xenophobia, anti-Semitism, nationalism, tribalism, anything that supports prejudice against innocent others, anything that leads to collective stereotyping and decreasing the benefit, the justice, and the goodness of people. The maxim al-ḍarar yuzāl, or harm must be eliminated, applies to so many fields in Islamic jurisprudence, from bush burning and harm to environment and the harm to other creatures that bush burning results in, apart from desertification and deforestation. If we look at the hadith on the blessing of planting a tree, even if that's the last thing you do when the day of judgment comes upon us, should make us contemplate more on the importance of not just planting trees, but protecting trees, and anything that will stop environmental degradation and the collapse of the ecological systems that are life-sustaining. The enforcement of animal rights and protection of animals. We see a lot of hadith where the Prophet showed concern for a bird whose chicks had been taken from the nest, and he is telling the Sahaba, who's causing anxiety to this bird? And he said, well, I took the eggs. And he said, put it back. The prohibition of causing harm to animals that we need to slaughter. If you look at the rules of slaughtering animals, Sharia wants us to find the most humane ways of killing animals that we need to eat. So you do not slaughter an animal in the presence of another animal. You do not slaughter an animal in a way that it feels pain. The knife has to be sharpened, but you don't even cause psychological pain. The Prophet said to somebody who was sharpening his knife while his animal was on the ground, why are you killing this animal twice? There's the psychological pain, and then there's the pain it necessarily goes through slaughtering. And so the need to try and see, do we have better methods, technologically advanced methods of more painless ways of killing animals? So some scholars would therefore encourage electrocution that immobilizes an animal, where it has gone into coma for a couple of seconds, for a few minutes while slaughtering takes place, using morphine, gas injections, things that could make the animal unconscious whatever it is that would reduce the pain to the best degree possible, that is also halal. We find the prohibition of by the Prophet, actually, during Jahiliyyah period, some of these Arabs would use their knife or sword to cut off a piece of the hump of a living camel. And the Prophet not just prohibited it, but also considered that meat as itself najas. It's impure. It's like feces. You can't consume it. The punishment, as it were, of slaughtering an animal in an inappropriate manner. So if you put your knife to slaughter an animal and you're in the middle of slaughtering, and then your phone rang, and then you lifted the thing and told somebody, listen, I'm slaughtering an animal, let me finish. And then you take your knife and go back to slaughter it. That animal becomes najas and prohibited for you to eat. It doesn't matter what the value of that cow might have been, $500, $1,000. It's haram to consume it. And that's a punishment for having caused that pain to the animal, apart from the sin of it that one has to repent for. There's the wastage of that, but Allah is not going to allow you to benefit from harm, which is an important argument to look at when it comes to organic food and the harm that inorganic sometimes causes, or eating agricultural products that come from a lot of very industrial factory farming kind of agricultural practices instead of going for free range. When you look at the battery cage chicken, some people are so hurt by how modern industrial agriculture treats animals. They prefer to go vegetarian. They prefer to go vegan. I would not be surprised if the Prophet took the same measure in some of our cities, where some people just don't care about how the animal was treated, or whether we are causing harm to the environment through some of our heavy soil impact agricultural practice. The shark fin soup, and it's not all shark fin soup, but one practice in some places is they catch these sharks in some customs, or like in Chinese cuisine, shark fin soup is a delicacy. Unfortunately, what some fishermen do is they catch the shark. It's still alive. They cut the fins off and throw the shark back into the water, and it just drowns slowly with all that pain. I don't think any scholar would say that is halal to consume just because it is fish. When you look at how these sharks were killed, fishing using live bait, where a small live fish is hooked and thrown into the water. And because of the agony of the pain of the fish, it sends vibrations in the water that predatory fish pick up and rush. So it's easy to catch fish using live bait. But think about it. Do you really have to put that fish in that agony just because you want a sport? If somebody has that as that's the only way he and his family would survive, then maybe that's a lesser evil. But for many who are in sports fishing, or who are just doing it as a hobby, really, remember a woman was cruel to a cat, and because of that, the Prophet ﷺ said, because she didn't feed the cat or allow it to go and get its food, it starved to death. But Allah put her in hell and punished her because of a cat. Just as somebody gave water to a thirsty dog and had their sins forgiven. It's not going to be funny if you, on the day of judgment, you come up just because you were cruel to a frog or a fish or some other creature. If you have to use a worm, maybe kill the worm before you put it on the hook. But the need for us to try and reduce the suffering in Allah's creatures, because every harm is haram by default. So the need to really think, some people in some cultures just like fishing and like hunting, but the traps we use, the fishing methods, maybe we should look at artificial lures or fly fishing, or something that is less harmful. The need to look at the design of our abattoirs and how animals are killed. The need to look, in the view of some scholars, at policies and laws of preventing takfir. Takfir of identifying kufr and what takes a person out of Islam, just as it's important to know what brings a person into Islam, is important. But when we look at the damaging impact of the average incompetent Muslim calling another a kafir, and then another incompetent one taking the laws into their own hands and deciding this is the law, again, you find removing harm being a premise that scholars use to put regulations around who can do takfir and how takfir can actually be classified as hate speech that leads to atrocities. We've seen it in areas where Muslims have been allowed to do this, and some feel it should only be done by competent, approved preachers or courts of law where they've got the jurisdiction and they've got the knowledge of the law. Regulating marriage, regulating polygamy, regulating divorce. Generally, this is left unregulated. It's left to anybody. You want to get married, traditionally, it's just the families get together, they have a witness, somebody there to conduct the marriage, and it's done. The state and government doesn't know anything about it. But more and more people are finding forced marriages taking place behind closed doors, underage, no limit to the age of people. And in Sharia, there's a principle in Islamic jurisprudence of saddu zariya and concern for maslaha, preclusion, preventing what leads to harm, what is also called taqyid al-mubah, restricting what is normally permissible. You can move at any speed you want. There's no prohibition in the Quran or Sunnah. But when it's clear it leads to measurable harm, then jurists have a right to restrict what is usually permissible. The age at which people marry is usually left to families and communities and cultures to decide. But where it's clear this leads to harm, governments, Islamic courts have the right to restrict the age of limit, just the age limit for marriage, just as they have the right to restrict age of driving, age at which you hold a weapon. So you have a lot of these regulations. So there are a lot of regulations that this maxim allows scholars to use to ensure harm is decreased in society, and violence, damage, anything that leads to harm. You can look at Black Lives Matter and look at the kind of reform some societies have put in order to avoid racism, but the same type of thing we need to do to avoid religious prejudice and prejudicing people of color, of various ethnicities, and anything that is harmful. I'll stop there, inshallah. Where I've made mistakes, I pray Allah to forgive me and to continue to guide us aright. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Jazakallah khair for that, Sheikh. It's certainly something that it brings some light into avoiding all the things that are harmful and making that precedent. So guys, if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat, or if you raise your hands, I can unmute you that you can ask it if you prefer doing that. For those of you who are looking on YouTube, there's a chat in YouTube. Please type your questions there, and we will have Sheikh answer them. So Sheikh, while everyone is thinking up over their questions and coming out about looking at this, so if I'm to understand correctly, pretty much is, if we should always try to avoid doing harm. It's about making sure that everything else is protected, both life things as well as maybe things that are inanimate. If that inanimate something, that someone has an attachment to it, then that can be causing harm indirectly to that particular person, and so we should avoid doing harm in every respect. So that is certainly something that we We need to. But when it comes to doing good, you made mention about sometimes doing harm. Avoiding doing harm takes precedence over doing good. Is that what I was getting? Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the natural tendency of humans is to be good. You know, you've got more people greeting people every morning than insulting each other. You've got more people helping than harming. You've got more people living peacefully with each other than at war. If you can just focus on removing harm, good becomes the default. So in that sense, bad is actually more like a stain on human beings. And if you can just focus on removing bad, most people will ensure the good is taken care of. Also, preventing bad usually requires some form of effort, conflict. If you wanted to stop bad happening, if you wanted to do good and charity, usually there's nobody who's going to disturb you about doing good. It's when somebody is harming others and they benefit from that harm that usually get into a fight. If you want to stop corruption, they say corruption tries to fight back. And so it is the path less traveled, or the road less traveled for most people. And so it's a priority when the good and the bad are the same. Sharia would say the bad takes precedence, you know, it's a priority. Yeah, you have to have something good that is really beneficial that would justify a little harm. So the side effect of a medicine, for example, is bad, but the main effect is good. So we go ahead with the medicine.
Right. Now, I guess we can look at this in terms of an opportunity as well, right? Because if I understood it correctly, if we avoid doing harm, so let's say we saw something and we were going to do it and we changed our minds, right? Something bad, whether it's harming an animal or whatever, and we changed our mind. Do we get a sort of a one blessing for avoiding doing that harm so that it's an
Yeah,
opportunity for us? Yes.
yeah, it's actually part of the rahmah of Allah and how He rewards jihad bin nafs, you know, the struggle within yourself, not even outside. Just you're having planned to do something bad, you don't have a sin, but fighting that urge. Maybe you've fallen in love with somebody who's already married, maybe, and you're struggling with it. You know, it's just your personal quiet struggle. But that's a big reward. It's not easy for some people. A young person who keeps himself away from zina, it doesn't need to be a young person. It could be anybody who could have done bad, but instead decided not to. And so even though in the outside world, nothing happened, it was all just a battle within my heart from desiring something bad, wanting to do it, saying I shouldn't and not doing it. And, you know, nothing happened in the outside world, but I get reward for that struggle. And depends on the level of the struggle, Allah decides what kind of reward. He knows how much I struggled. Wallahu alam.
Allah. That's good. All right, so we have a couple questions in the chat. So one of them is, if someone has been condemned to life support machine until they die, is the family right to ask the doctor to stop the machines and avoid further unnecessary medical bills?
Absolutely. But what usually happens is, and what is usually advised is that the call should be for the medical professional. Now, in some places, there's health insurance paying for this, and so the medical professionals would determine if they know from all their knowledge of this subject area, this person is not going to come back. They're brain dead. It's just the body that's still alive. Then the doctor who knows this subject would be the one to make that decision. In some countries, they would give the family the choice, especially if the family is the one paying for the life support. And so, you know, you have to look at who does that money go to, who's benefiting, and what's a better thing to do with the $100,000 that you could pay over the next year. to just keep this person on life support. It's a very emotionally difficult decision to make. And so it is sometimes preferable for the more knowledgeable of the in that subject area to be the ones to decide, and those who are less attached to the person, especially when there's no coming back, at least from the human assessment point of view. So is it right for the family to ask the doctors to stop the machines? Yes, it is right for them to do so, as difficult as it may be. Allahu Alam.
Good. And I guess as in addition to that, maybe it could be seen as having mercy or offering mercy, not just to the person who's on life support, but maybe having mercy to the people who have to pay these bills.
To pay the bills, to keep
Yes.
visiting the hospital, but also the opportunity cost. If you really want to show mercy, there are other people who that money could save their lives. And this money is not saving anybody's life, not from the opinion of the experts of that subject. And since Allah tells us, ask those who know, ask the more knowledgeable, ask the specialists, ask the professionals in that area. And if they say this person is gone, then why waste money? Why not bring faster closure to not just yourself, but the family and all those who care? So it's a difficult decision. And this is where I think scholars and professionals need to help families in making those tough decisions. And even after the decision is made, sometimes there can be that sense of guilt. But we have to be as rational as we can in this decision and choose between two evils, which is the greater evil, or which is the lesser evil, or which is the greater good in this decision making.
Yeah, right. Okay, so we have another question. What principles or simple steps can we apply in our daily decision making to avoid causing harm inadvertently?
Humans, we will always make mistakes. We will always cause harm. But I think if we have more open relationships with people, make it easy for people to let us know that they are being harmed by something we say, how we consult, how we speak, how we behave. There are some of us who, the moment we have a disagreement, we just go defensive, and some people are hurt by that. We behave like a crocodile. We just sometimes we just stonewall and just keep quiet, and it hurts the relationship. And somebody wants you to speak up, and you just keep quiet, and you don't know you're actually hurting the other person or hurting the relationship. So I think we always ask Allah in our du'as, in nasina aw akhtana, Allah forgive us for those things we do out of forgetfulness or out of mistakes. And yes, actions are judged by intentions, but we should try and live lives that are less harsh. And so habits of being more consultative, being more open, being more humble, being more approachable would probably help others in letting us know if we are causing inadvertent harm. Being more empathetic and allowing ourselves to be more influenced by victims of our lives, especially the people we live with, family, friends, children, spouses. Yeah. So I think habits like humility, more open-mindedness would make us know some of those inadvertent harms that we are causing. From time to time, just ask your wife or ask your husband, is there anything I am doing that you would rather I don't do? Find a gentle way of you bringing the topic up. Otherwise, they just use patience and sabr as the excuse to, just strengthen their shock absorbers to manage the bumpy road of life that you have caused them. I mean, they manage, but we could be more open to correction and just learn to accept that we are harming others inadvertently, and we want to find out how to reduce that. Wallahu alam.
Yeah, good. Okay, so we have another question. It's a long one. Assalamu alaikum. When trying to change cultural norms that are harmful to a marginalized group, The privileged who benefit from the status quo argue that they are harmed by any change. Their privilege blinds them to harm being inflicted on the marginalized. How do we deal with this charge that change is harmful to, example, racism, tribalism, gender injustice, etc.?
This is a very, very good, very important question, very difficult to answer. But this is again where you have what you would call structural forms of injustice that are sometimes just taken as part of the landscape, and we do not see how they harm. And if they harm, we tend to dismiss the harm and belittle its impact. I think one of those things the Prophet was known for was being close to the poor, being approachable, being empathetic to the needs of the marginalized, but also being consultative. Otherwise your arrogance prevents you from seeing how certain structures harm others. And arrogance is one of those diseases of the heart that is tied to pride. And I think something that people need is sometimes just greater exposure to the harm they are causing, having more methods of inclusivity, of getting victims to have more say. So there's a maxim where it says nothing about us without us. So the need to give more voices to the marginalized. And unfortunately, there are a lot of marginalized communities. Many of the poor are marginalized and they have no say in decision-making. People with physical disabilities, sometimes the minority religion is marginalized. Ethnic groups are marginalized. So I think real compassion, which is actually the test of faith, if you have no compassion, if you aren't modest enough, the Prophet ﷺ says, whoever doesn't have modesty, what have I got to do with you? So I think from a more strategic point of view, depending on what kind of marginalization is taking place within a particular cultural group, what the form of racism or tribalism or gender injustice that's taking place, and how can you get people within the privileged who can speak. If you want to reduce oppression against women in my community by men in a particular culture, what you need is to reach out to some of the men who the men would listen to, some who have just stereotypes against women. You need men to speak to those men and reason with them. If it's a tribal problem between a majority and a minority, you need members of the majority to start speaking up. Sometimes it's not safe, it's not easy. It's just like many Jews and Zionists who just don't see what's wrong with what's going on in Israel. And many Christians who don't see what's wrong. But it needs other Christians and other Jews speaking up to make them recognize, well, maybe there is something to think. So I think it's to identify people of the privileged group who benefit from the status quo, but who recognize this cannot be sustained. It is harmful. It can't be something we stand before Allah with, to also say something and see what they can do to change, so that break the stereotype. I'm sure there's a lot depending on the kind of injustice that we would want to change, but I hope that's useful, inshallah.
Inshallah. Okay, so we have another one. What happens when you unintentionally cause harm due to an unclear message, but it causes a negative outcome?
One of the legal maxims, so if I accidentally, for example, hit your car, Islamic jurisprudence would say the direct perpetrator is liable even though it was not deliberate. I will still have to repair the damage. In other words, you have to take responsibility for harm caused by you, even if it was unintentional. And generally, if I say something to you and you misunderstand, I shouldn't blame you for misunderstanding. I'm the one who opened my mouth to start with. So it is better for you to take responsibility for not having made the message clear. And one way of reducing that in many traditional societies is that when you say something, you try to have feedback. You know, what did you understand from what I said? And the person gives you feedback, fine. So try to be more conversational, even in passing information, to try and find out if your message was understood, especially if you seem to be the kind of person who everybody seems to be unclear about your message. Everybody seems to be misunderstanding you. Why you? You know, is it really that they deliberately misunderstood you? Or maybe you're not as articulate as others. Maybe your actions say something different and people misunderstand you. So the person communicating should take responsibility for their communication. And while people may have their own preconceptions and they misunderstood you, you know, that's outside your circle of influence. What is in your circle of influence is your communication method and probably the need to learn how to communicate better, to try and see whether others understood you properly before they leave. The Prophet would sometimes repeat a message 3 times just so that people got what he said. So, yeah, I think getting feedback and learning better communication skills would help in reducing people misunderstanding what you say. Allahu alam.
Yeah, and I think there's also a comment. Great question and great response, mashallah. One needs to believe that action for change is important and also identify the effective ambassadors for the engagement in order to promote and implement systematic change for the good of all humanity, inshallah. So I think that was just a comment. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, going back to the question about the one on marginalized groups, that's a huge issue. That's a huge issue, and I think you know, coming out of what you have said in terms of this maxim, it's just that we need to basically make ourselves more conscious of everything, starting with being conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you know, what is required of us. And I guess we just need to try and do our best to make sure we avoid doing harms. And as you said, we all make mistakes, so inadvertently we will. But what we need to do is how we deal with that, right? Or how we deal with that and how we correct that. You know, maybe by asking for forgiveness or trying to make it up, whatever it is, fix whatever the issue is. And lastly on that, I guess, is learning from those mistakes so that we don't. And then I guess you can add on to that, teach others about what we have learned so that they don't make the same mistakes. You know, so, but inshallah. Anyway, so are there any more questions? I don't have anything on YouTube, and I'm not seeing any more on the chat. So if there isn't any more questions, we'll wait for maybe a minute or so. But if there isn't any more questions, we want to thank everyone for joining us today. And Sheikh, certainly, Jazakallah khair for, you know, taking the time out to share your knowledge with us and sharing these maxims. Can you give us a brief intro into next week's session so that we're all aware of what's coming up next week?
So, so this session, for those who came late, was really looking at the maxim harm must be eliminated, al-ḍarar yuzāl, and it's really to do with all forms of harm, anything that's not good, anything that's detrimental, and how we find ways of preventing and removing and identifying. You know, even the research institutes that we put to investigate problems, investigate causes, all this is about identifying harm that needs to be removed or reduced. Next time, however, we will be looking not at the harm, but look at the victims and what Sharia requires when it comes to victims of harm. So the maxim would be al-mashaqqa tajlibu at-taysir, that hardship, undue suffering calls for taysir, ease, facilitation. And this has a lot to do with the concessions that Sharia gives victims of different forms of injustice. A lot of laws that are relaxed, and we will be looking not just at people who are in darura, people who are in situations of dire necessity, but those who are in lesser forms of necessity. You know, when can a person show their aura to a doctor of the opposite gender? Does it need something life-threatening, or are there other maxims that regulate the compassion? And so we will be seeing a lot on how Sharia regulates the compassion we show, so that you don't just fling the doors open just because somebody is in a little bit of difficulty, but also you don't tighten the doors when Sharia needs and Sharia prescribes compassion to victims of various levels of hardship. So inshallah, next time we meet, we will be looking at this maxim, al-mashaqqa tajlibu at-taysir. Hardship calls for ease, facilitation, since that's one of them. Actually, maqasid, Allah makes it clear, Allah desires ease, He doesn't desire hardship for us. So we'll be looking at that, inshallah, next week.
Inshallah. So Jazakallah khair for everyone who attended, and certainly Sheikh, Jazakallah khair for sharing that. So we look forward to your session next week, and everyone, same time, same place, and as Yusuf Estevs always say, with free parking. So in that, inshallah, with that, inshallah, see you guys next week. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Assalamu alaikum.